we're going to move into our first conversation, a panel conversation entitled, "What does it mean to build change from the ground up?" And the aim of this session is to explore how we might begin our work for social justice by listening to the local context, how we can hear and respond to lived experience in our communities, and how we can then use that to inform effective action for change at every level in society. And I'm really glad that I'm joined now by three people who bring rich and varied expertise in different ways to our explorations. And I invite them to come and join me on these chairs here. And as I introduce each of them, I will be asking them a question to help them introduce themselves to us. Well, I'm going to introduce each of them in turn, and as I introduce them, as I say, I'll ask them to answer a question which helps establish who they are and what they might bring to this conversation, and then we'll open up a conversation between everyone. I'm going to start with Matthew, if that's all right. Matthew van den Boyde, who is Chief Strategy Officer of the Trussell Trust, which supports the UK's biggest network of food banks to provide emergency food and support to people locked in poverty. But it has a vision, which we'll hear about, which is for a future where there is no need for food banks. Matthew's passion for social change was ignited through experiences of working with marginalised young people, both overseas and in the UK. And before Trussell, he also worked at the Bible Society, where we worked with him in some ways as JPIT as well. So it's lovely to welcome you here, Matthew, particularly because you've stood in at short notice for Emma Ravi, who's the Chief Executive of Trussell Trust, sends her apologies that she couldn't be here in the end today because of an important family reason. So thank you, Matthew, for joining us. So the question that we start with from you, Matthew, is about the cost of living crisis, which has obviously been in the headlines for weeks now. We'll all have noticed the rising prices of food and fuel. What are you hearing at the moment through the Trussell network about how increasing living costs are affecting people, and how are you responding as an organisation with this vision of a future where there isn't any hunger?
Great, thanks, Simeon. It's lovely to be here today. Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry that you're not having the full Emma Reevey experience. I was going to wear a blonde wig so that you could kind of imagine, but I decided not to. So at Trussell Trust, for those who may not know, we support a network of 1,300 food banks based in local communities across the UK. And Simeon, as you say, our vision is for a UK without the need for our services. We don't think it's right, and we don't think it's just that people will have to rely on emergency food to get by. So in response to your question, there's something about actively listening to what's coming through our network, that kind of reach out into local communities and regular contact with people who are really at the hard edge of the cost of living crisis. And I think we probably have two modes of listening. As an organisation, we value experience, and we value people's stories, and obviously on a day-to-day basis, people in food banks, including here, for those who are here on site in Waterloo at Oasis, where people will come and receive emergency food support, but will also receive hospitality and a warm welcome and an opportunity to kind of share some of those experiences. So we hear those stories coming through. And I think it's fair to say that, as many of you will know, people who tend to access a food bank's support are often at the very kind of toughest edge of poverty. And so they'll frequently be going without all sorts of forms of essentials, not just food. The problem is not access to food, it's access to money to buy all of life's essentials. And so we are hearing how, rather than always people being provided with food supplies that they might take home and cook, instead food banks are reporting that increasingly people are asking for food supplies that they don't need to heat, so that they don't have to use cooking utensils, and they also don't have to do the washing up. They don't have to turn on hot water to do to do the washing up, and obviously oven, gas, etc. So we're providing more cold packs of food. We're also providing more kettle packs of food, so a kind of way in which people can heat food, but just with minimal energy costs. And food banks are reporting that people are coming not just asking for support around food, but also asking for advice about how to keep warm at home. What's the best way? Should I be staying under my duvet all day? Should I be walking around? What should I be doing? Heartbreaking questions that people are asking. We're also very aware about the precarious nature of people's finances, particularly after the pandemic. A lot of people have been kind of trying to get by through very tough times, experiencing things like furlough or loss of jobs, and also kind of increased levels of kind of mental health challenges, I think, as well, which are kind of resulting in people's kind of situations being quite precarious. And I think food banks across our network are reporting more and more people coming to need our services who might be struggling with cumulative problems that have kind of mounted up over the last couple of years, but which are now coming to head. People felt that they were going to just kind of get through the pandemic, but now the cost of living has come like a massive sting in the tail. In fact, just hearing recently from one of our team in the Northwest who was talking about the pandemic being like a roller coaster that kind of went up and up and up and kind of made very visible the kind of problem in people's minds. It kind of like, really came to the peak and then started whooshing down, and everybody was very aware of food insecurity during the pandemic. And now it feels like it's gone into, a roller coaster goes into a tunnel, and it now feels quite hidden, and the velocity hasn't slowed down, and in fact it's increasing, but it's hidden. The pandemic shone a light on something that's now been slightly obscured. So those kind of stories are coming through. But we also hear, and we listen to data. Many of you will know that Trust Food Banks, we work on a referral-based system, and so when someone is referred to our services, we're able to kind of demonstrate the scale of need that is increasing. We can go into the figures later, but 2.1 million people, 2.1 million emergency parcels distributed through our 1,300 food banks in the last financial year. Just 14% increase on the year prior to the pandemic. The pandemic was a bit funny, it went a bit kind of sky high for all sorts of different reasons. But over a 5-year period, an 81% increase in food bank parcels distributed by Trust Food Banks. But in terms of the cost of living crisis, in the last 2 quarters of the last financial year, as we started to see that bite, an accelerated kind of increase on the prior period too. So stories and data bearing out that we're seeing significant change. I think probably, I should finish, I know, just how are we responding? I think we want to make sure that we are doing the very best at a local level to support people who are facing significant challenges. One of the ways, just like boots on the ground, that we're trying to do this is by really increasing access to financial inclusion services in food banks. So lots of food banks already would be kind of signposting people to where they can get support around maximising their income. But now we've kind of grant funded and secured support for many more of our food banks to have advisors in session, so that when somebody is presenting with very low levels of income and their principal source of income is social security and benefits very often, we can do some work with them around kind of how do we make sure you are receiving the full entitlement of your benefits, particularly around things like disability. So trying to be very practical, as well as taking those stories and data to government and challenging around the big decisions. And again, we can come on to that bit. So I hope that's enough of an intro.
Thank you very much, Matthew. The connection to our next panellist is, I guess, Drinka Rallo, who works with Migrant Organise, working in a very different field, a very different kind of policy area, a very different set of challenges, but a similar commitment to listening to experience and to working with the experiences that people are bringing into that situation. Let me just introduce Drinka. Drinka's organisation has a vision for an inclusive and welcoming society with a fair immigration system. And it builds a platform for those with lived experience to deliver change. Originally, Drinker is a journalist from Sarajevo and has been involved in work around refugees and human rights since leaving Bosnia in 1993. And Drinker is also the founder of the Women on the Move Awards. So we're really glad to have you with us, Drinker. We wanted to ask you, Migrants Organise is all about bringing lived experience of asylum seekers and of refugees into the centre of campaigning. Can you share something about why you take that approach and how that works?
First of all, thank you, and thank you for coming today. And it's really nice to be here today and be centered around hope and experiences of people. Part of what we realized as an organization and as a community is that change can only be led by people who are affected by issues that we're dealing with. And when it comes to refugees and migrants, that can be very challenging because people are traumatized, isolated, have really difficult experience when they come here. So then we thought, okay, well, how can we then build a platform which will bring them up to that space and facilitate their power? And we're organizers, and you have a workshop about organizing here today with Citizens UK. And our understanding of power is that it's an ability to act. So we then try to bring people out of this space of exclusion, oppression, shame, poverty, into the spaces where they can be human beings with dignity and where they can do things to achieve justice for themselves and others. And as you can imagine, that is very difficult in general. It was particularly difficult during the pandemic. But the way we do that is that we're in a constant process of listening. So even though I'm a person with first-hand experience, we tend to call it first-hand rather than lived, because while we're all alive, we all kind of have a lived experience. But a first-hand experience, that was 30 years ago. So we need to make sure that we're bringing people up to be heard and to have agency, those who are experiencing it right now. And that's a challenge. And in many ways that starts to very small relational interactions. And we have, every year we have hundreds of volunteers, and when they come and join us, we say, oh, can you go and do a walking group? And people say, what do you mean, just walk? And for many of our people, that is one of the few normal things that they do, and they're so isolated that, you know, it's really hard to walk by yourself all the time in the park that you don't know, especially during a pandemic when people are in hotels. But that's the space where we, in a safe way, can start having conversations as humans. And then we listen. And then we identify things that we hear frequently from people. We provide legal advice to more than 600 individuals and families, many of them in hotels. So then we bring that into some organized campaign. But we never push, we never pressure people. It's really important that they come to this experience when it's good for them. So some people will arrive to this experience of speaking out sooner rather than later. Some people, like Simba, who had a stroke at the age of 30 and then was charged £98,000 when he woke up because he was a refused asylum seeker. He didn't speak out for 6 years before, but now it was life and death experience. So this is, sometimes people come to the to the speaking out part and organizing part when they can't bear it anymore on their own. And then we're there around Simba to support Simba with whatever Simba needs. So, we're just organizing a week of action. We now have a group of 60 community organizations around the country, 150 of organizers who are leading charge. And we're organizing a week of action next week. And the community decided everything. When the week of action will be, they decide and define what actions are. They decide and define what a hashtag is. And if I don't like it, I have to live with it. So these are, and so the next, and sort of to kind of round it up, the next step is then to take action with people. And some of you may be familiar with Nazareth Manifesto, which talks about working for the people and then working with the people. But there's a third way of being, which is being with the people. And that's what we at Migrants Organized do. We're walk along on that journey with the people. We're being with the people. And I think that would be sort of place where I would stop. I can talk more about obviously what happened yesterday in courts and Rwanda policy, and I also just want to say I've left some nice badges and materials with colleagues from Welcome Network, because I have a comms emergency of hate on Twitter that I have to attend to, so I can't stay all day with you. But I can talk about that a bit more as well.
We will come on to talk about that. Thank you, Drinker. But it seems a good moment actually to bring in our third panellist to welcome Reverend Al Barrett, who is the rector of Hodge Hill Church, a partnership between the URC and the Church of England in the east of Birmingham. Also a theologian and writer most recently of Being Interrupted, reimagining the church's mission from the outside in, a call to the church to open the door to creative disruption of the status quo. And Al, I know a lot of your work and your ministry has been about trying to discover the gifts in your community rather than focusing on the challenges, and doing exactly as Rinka was saying, of being with and starting there. Could you tell us a bit about the journey you've been on and what changes when we start to work in that way?
Sure, thanks, Sonia. So Hodge Hill is about 3 miles east of the centre of Birmingham, and I live on the Furs and Bromford estate within Hodge Hill, which is in many ways a typical outer estate on the edge of a city, historically white working class, but now wonderfully ethnically diverse as well. And for neighbourhoods like ours, one of the big questions is, what kind of story do we tell? And there are stories that are told about us. Labels like Scroungers and Workshy and Sink Estate are used of communities like ours, but also of the people who live within them. And the danger of stories told about us is that those who live on an estate like mine begin to believe those stories of ourselves. There are stories that my neighbours have lived over time that are about being ignored and overlooked, about being done to, about being promised the world and then being let down, of organisations coming in and then going away again. And there are stories that my neighbours have told about what it means to live locally. When I arrived in our estate 12 years ago, a common theme was Bromford is shit, nothing happens here, I can't wait to leave. And as a local church, one of the temptations is to want to do something about all of that, is to want to come in and try and fix it. And what we have been learning over the years is that that temptation is precisely kind of replicating that doing to approach that has been so damaging to our neighbours. And so we've tried to find ways of looking, of opening our eyes to what is around us already, to what is happening already, and listening to our neighbours and hearing their stories. And that's taken us on a journey of long-term, intergenerational, grassroots building of community that has started with unearthing the connectors locally, those people who naturally know their neighbours, who know who's in trouble, who know who has a lawnmower that they can borrow, who know how to link people together, often across all kinds of differences, to enable one person's gifts to deal with another person's need. We are learning how to discover but also nurture places of belonging, places of welcome, places where people might come thinking that what they come with is a need, but are invited into a space where they discover what their gifts are, what their passions are, and how those gifts and passions can be used and shared with their neighbours, so that they become not one-dimensional people labelled by their need or their disability or whatever, but actually three-dimensional people that are rich and complex and gifted, and dignity emerges in the process of that. And then we've been learning how to invite people, once they discover what their passions and gifts are, to be able to step into positions of leadership, not in conventional kind of up the front kind of ways, but in grassroots, kind of in the middle of the room, connecting kind of forms of leadership, where people can lead on the things that they care about, can lead on things that are often about creating fun and joy and laughter and love within communities, as much as kind of tackling the problems head on. Because actually tackling the problems often comes indirectly, tangentially, through those spaces of love and friendship and belonging. And we're discovering that in the process we begin to learn community power, what actually we can do together for each other in local communities, and that only then, once we know a bit of that, will we know what we need from outsiders, from external agencies. Only then do we begin to know what justice looks like, because we then know actually where the gaps are. We then know what are the things that we can't do for ourselves, that we need a fairer sharing of resources to do for us. And I guess in that process we begin to realise another way of framing poverty that is about that empathy deficit that the theologian Alistair McIntosh talks about, that is actually about a pathology of the rich rather than of the poor, of those of us who are more resourced, more wealthy, not seeing our neighbours for all that they are, and not being close enough to be with them in ways that actually enable us to know what a good society looks like. And I think the last thing that I'd want to say is that post-COVID, we've been learning particularly what it means to go at the speed of trust, to go slowly, to value the small, to acknowledge the fragility of everything that we're involved in and of ourselves in the process, but to know that there's no way of easily bypassing that.
Thank you. Real echoes of what Shrinka was saying as well, starting with the walking together. I wonder if I might ask Matthew, because Trussell Trust has had an interesting journey over the last few years, I think, of moving from perhaps more of a service provider feel to one that has now this vision and is working with those who come to the food banks much more on advocacy. Can you tell us kind of what's prompted that journey and how it's changing Trussell's approach?
Sure. So I think it'd be fair to say that the activism and the care and the compassion that is rooted in church communities around the UK was integral to the formation and the kind of the early stages and development and expansion of the Trussell Trust Food Bank network, and we're proud of that, and we are enriched by that. But I think it would also be fair to say that some of that was characterised by a kind of sense of compassion that perhaps, reflecting particularly what you said, Al, might have come from a bit more of a paternalistic kind of frame of thinking. And I think, as with any sort of sense of journeying, you mature in your thinking as you go about your practice. And I think that the listening, in particular, to people whose experiences were being shared week in, week out with people leading food bank sessions, prompted increasing demands within our own kind of network for a deeper understanding of what a just solution might look like, rather than kind of just service provision. And so 3 years ago, we began a process of kind of just trying to redefine a little bit about our vision and our values, working together with our trustees, obviously, and the network, but most importantly with people who were accessing our services at that kind of grassroots level, and co-designing together a kind of new vision for a UK without the need for food banks. And what we mean by that is not a UK where there is a deficit of care and compassion, or no need for that care and compassion, but that actually that it's spontaneous and it's ad hoc, rather than the kind of structural net that food banks are providing in the absence of structures that should be there to kind of support people. So that kind of increasing need for food banks even is the problem that we're trying to address. And as you say, Simeon, we really have been on a journey also around this whole topic of how do we make sure that people with experience are bringing their giftedness, their experiences, their views to shape and craft how those solutions are delivered. So we're very early in our journey with this. It's a lifelong set of relationships, isn't it? And so we're trying to support and nurture frameworks which enable food bank teams, and sometimes part of the wider charity that they might be part of, whether that's a church charity or a non-church charity, to take steps in terms of how do we make sure that we're involving people with experience of that kind of severe financial insecurity at every aspect of decision making. Just to mention two very practical examples of that. One is on the ground, we are supporting and funding community organisers, these kind of roles, which can help to bring that kind of attentive listening over a period of time, and actually the identification of, this is where we are experiencing power, and this is where we're experiencing powerlessness, and how do we respond to that together. So 60 food banks in our network kind of piloting these community organising approaches. And the other being, I think I did, so this is personal guilt here. I think I tried to excuse myself, feeling like, well, we're a second-tier organisation. We serve frontline food banks, and food banks support people in crisis. And so we're quite removed, and that's okay. And we've been challenged, particularly working with people. We've been really blessed to work with Martin Johnson, who might be familiar to many of you, who's challenged me personally and us as an organisation to be saying, no, that's not good enough. You need to be actually enriched, informed, shaped by people's experiences at the very heart of what you're doing. So we've spent a lot of time over the last 18 months investing in building nurtured relationships with people who are speaking into our governance structures, our executive team, our project management side of things, and then in the delivery of what we're doing in the training of food banks through engagement in kind of sustained relationships like that.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on the point that Al was making about stories, and ask Rinka, in terms of the stories we tell ourselves and we tell of ourselves, but particularly when it comes to asylum and migration issues in our public narratives. There are two very competing lots of stories around on there about what's going on here, and therefore what the right policy responses are. Could you share a bit about how you're telling stories in response to what's going on, and what's your take on what's going on in policy terms at the moment?
I'm just looking at the clock because it's probably going to take me hours, so you're going to have to just push me to stop. I mean, I was just talking to some students on Thursday about this and picking on the language around Rwanda. So people were issued with notices of relocation to Rwanda. And it's Rwanda plan. And when you read that, it sounds so innocuous. Oh, it's just a relocation. And it's a notice. So a lot of how we talk about some of these issues is hiding the true nature of it, despite the fact that the government has labeled its policy the hostile environment. So they're talking to different sets of the audiences or playing to different galleries. So here we're being tough, but in our toughness, we're actually being fair because it's just a relocation. And I was remembering an incident when somebody asked me to relocate on the beach and how upsetting I found that. So, you know, there's something about factual missing from a lot of the public narrative that even journalists are not picking up on. I'm sure you've all heard of the Amal's Journey and the Arts Project, which I thought was wonderful. And people's reactions and the attention that the whole art project has received. But then I was reading media coverage and I could not find anything that posed the question, why is Amal walking? Why is a child walking 8,000 kilometers? Why can't she fly? And when I wrote that, I couldn't publish it. Nobody wanted to publish it. Because there are certain narratives and certain stories that we're hearing that are not palatable for the mainstream media anymore. And we're struggling because people are struggling to accept the level of oppression, the level of hostility that people are exposed to. And that makes me very angry, and I need to work harder. But Arundhati Roy summed it up. There's no such thing as voiceless. There's only deliberately silenced and preferably unheard. And that's what's happening. So in that climate, it's much harder for us, first of all, to put the facts out because facts are so out of fashion. So when you try to be factual, people are like, boring, we don't want to know, it's not more than 140 characters. So the truth is undermined in that process because it's complicated. And then there is a challenge in how we safely share stories of people, and then how are those stories not being exploited? So one of the challenges, so we found that in our quest for justice as opposed to charity, which means that people who are sharing stories are not just telling their life stories, but they're also part of a broader movement in which they're invested. They made decisions, they are strategizing on, and they have action for those who are listening. So it's actionable, radical listening that's demanded at the end of that story, which is, I need you to do this on social media. I want you to look at this website, this Fair Immigration Charter. You need to look at it. If you can sign it, please share it. If you have a church, maybe it needs to become a sanctuary when the raids are happening. So every interaction where these experiences are shared needs to have some kind of solidarity action demand at the end of it. That leads us towards structural change, which is going to take a very long time. And that's why we define our work and we brought back the word solidarity and borders into the same slogan, which is solidarity knows no borders. So as much as we can do within our own power and then combine that power. So we must not look for the lowest common denominator as to how we can be together, but we need to be the sum of our powers. Thank you.
Thank you. Al, could I bring you in there? Because that seems very, very much in tune with the approach that you've been trying to take in your context. What have you found about trying to bring about change with that new discovery of the local power? And can I also ask you, what changes that, because we're doing this as Christians, you know, the two linked questions?
I think we've been learning something about the scale of change. That there, for us, there is something really significant about the neighbourhood as the scale where this starts. One of my best friends locally is a Somali Muslim who, when we first moved to the estate, said to us, "This is just a place where we sleep. We do our shopping elsewhere. We take our kids to madrasa elsewhere. We go to the mosque elsewhere. But we would love to feel like we belong here. We would love to live here, the fullness of our life." And so it's been really important to us that actually those primary units of belonging in the local neighbourhood have been our first focus in terms of change. We've wanted to shift the story so that people are now able to say, actually, you know, this is the place that we call home. This is the place where we have friends. This is the place where we feel like we belong. This is the place where we can act. And so that agency begins for us in the local. We've had an interesting conversation with Citizens UK over the years, because we've been approached a number of times to say, you know, how can citizens coming to us and saying, how can we help you? How can you become part of us? And a lot of the time we've had to say, actually, the work that we're having to do is at least one layer down from citizens. Citizens mostly operates at the level of institutions. And actually the reality is our community has not really had any institutions. And so a lot of our work has been slow, patient building of those units where people can say, we belong here, this is where we find our voice. And only once that belonging has kind of become rooted and robust can people even contemplate the idea of going into Birmingham city centre, just 3 miles away, and being part of an assembly or a gathering or an action or whatever that's kind of, you know, in closer to the places of power. So that journey has been slow, but we've also been conscious of the urgency of it. And there's a tension there and a paradox there, I think. The other place where I'd want to talk about change is facing the future of a world where climate catastrophe actually dominates the way things are. And on a very, very small level, it's been important to us to work with our neighbours to grow stuff, to grow food, to share food together, to be less dependent on Tesco, or in our case, One Stop, which is Tesco but kind of twice as expensive and with half the choice. To be less dependent on those kind of modes of supplying food, and to be less dependent on anything that involves petrol. And you know, we know that they're small and ridiculously modest, and actually, in a sense, they don't change the world. But our gut instinct is that that is the only way that the world is going to change from where we start. So that's the change stuff for us. In terms of Christianity, I feel like in places like this over the last few years, I've been the grumpy voice that has actually had to say, there's a whole load wrong with Christianity that we need to face. Actually, there's a whole load of Christian pathologies that we need to address before we can actually say, here's the great resources of the Christian tradition that we can employ here. Some of the pathologies are an anxiety about numbers, and whenever we see someone, we see them as a potential churchgoer and giver rather than a full human being, and we need to let go of that. Another pathology is the desire to serve in a one-directional kind of way that, Matthew, you touched on earlier, or to speak for in a way that actually quashes the voices of those who really need to do the speaking. I think another pathology, particularly for sort of polite middle-class white people like me, is to want everything to be nice. And actually we need to make space for anger. And we need to resist anything that's about creating harmony prematurely. And again, for people like me, actually the desire to colonize and control spaces, we absolutely have to let go of, but it's so ingrained in many of our Christian traditions that actually we have a long way of unlearning to go on first. But very, very briefly, sin, I think, is something worth holding on to as a structural thing, but also as something that infects each and every one of us. And we need to be able to name that quite boldly. We need to remember that humility comes from the same root as humus, that actually literally we are grounded in the same stuff together. And lastly, we need to remember that resurrection is something that comes out of the compost heap, comes out of those places, the waste spaces at the edges of our world, and that resurrection is about solidarity in our humanness, discovering community in the midst of our woundedness, and that actually that's the hope that we have to go.
Thank you. That leads into the last question I was going to ask each of you, which is, on a day like today, we're trying to unearth hope. And you've already spoken about growing things, Al, as one of the ways that you feel you're kind of acting in your locality. But for each of you, working in really challenging fields, challenging terrain, in a challenging and hostile environment at times, how do you keep going? Or what gives you hope at the moment? Drinker, just start with you.
Yes, tough questions. This is what gives me hope. It says, people power is unlimited. My people and my community give me power, hope, resilience, inspiration, and laughter. And really good anger as well. I'm raging all the time, which gets me out of the bed in the morning. But then all these other things help me turn that anger into something constructive. And being with my community is how I maintain my sanity. I mean, I've been at Migrants Organized now for 21 years. This is my 11th Home Secretary and 6th Prime Minister. And I'm still here. And I still have hope. And I'm not giving up. And, you know, us being here today, on a nice and sunny day, people putting their time and energy and their faith and their hope in conversation, in learning, in caring. And I'm not excluding people on Zoom. They're with us as well. So, and then all of us, we have this rule is each one bring one. So all of us will be moved in different ways after today, and we'll talk about other people, and it's going to spread and cascade in different ways. But truth is out there, just needs to be found, as is hope.
Thank you. Matthew.
I was going to say people as well, so I'm going to innovate slightly here. So it is people power. I think maybe just to add a kind of a different perspective on that, we spent a long time as we were thinking about who we are together as a network of people around our shared values, and I think those are the things that I go back to when I'm feeling hopeless, because they are all really centered around the hope, a deep hope, and a sense of purpose together. Our organisational values are compassion, that sense of wanting to take the hit for somebody else, and alongside somebody else, and stand in solidarity alongside somebody. That sense of giving of oneself to another. Justice, that it's not enough just to do that, but also to stand together and to promote long-lasting solutions that allow us all to flourish. Community. This is our movement is a movement built of people who care about their local communities, who want the best in that sense of who we are together, and dignity, our sense of the value, and in this context, that God-given value that resides in each individual. That means that we all matter, no matter what.
Thank you. And Al?
I mean, a similar kind of riff on the same theme, but the spaces where we can be with others and be ourselves, let our defences drop, embrace our fragility, know that hope and grief sit alongside each other, and discover those moments of joy bubbling up.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of our panelists today. We want to offer our thanks, but also our solidarity, and I think our prayers and our good wishes to each of you in your different endeavours. I found that really inspiring and challenging and inspirational, and there's so much more that I want to think about, and I could carry on talking with you for another half an hour, but that's not allowed. So thank you, and can we express our appreciation?